I'll write this as a complete standalone script in first person, targeting an American audience, addressing the audience by relationship terms. You parents, you dads out there, etc., fixing the key issues identified, especially closing every loose thread, including the grandchild's fate, keeping internal logic consistent, and trimming the philosophical padding. After my daughter told me I would embarrass her in front of her new in-laws, I quietly stopped paying for my grandson's private school. 11 days later, my phone rang 43 times in a single afternoon. My name is Harold Whitfield. I am 68 years old, and for 6 years I paid every dollar of tuition, every uniform, every field trip fee for my grandson Miles, while I drove a truck with 210,000 miles on it and ate dinner alone every single night. I want to tell you exactly how a quiet man finds his spine again, because I think a lot of you watching this know exactly what it feels like to be useful to your own family only when you're writing a check. Before I go further, tell me where you're watching from tonight, would you, friend? I always like knowing who's sitting with me for this. I spent 38 years as a claims adjuster for a regional insurance company, the last 20 of them investigating fraud. People assume that job is about paperwork. It isn't. It's about pattern recognition. You learn to read a house fire report and know within 10 minutes whether the family said it themselves. You learn to read a man's face when he's telling you the truth and when he's performing the truth for your benefit. I built a career on the simple principle that people show you who they are in the small inconsistencies long before they ever show you in the big ones. I just never thought I'd need to apply that skill to my own daughter. My wife Carol died 4 years ago. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed late, gone in 5 months. When she went, the house went quiet in a way I still haven't gotten used to. My daughter Renee was 31 at the time, married to a man named Todd who sold commercial real estate and talked about closing the way other men talk about football. They had one son, Miles, who was 7 when his grandmother died, and who I have loved since the second the hospital nurse put him in my arms. Carol and I never had much. We raised Renee on a claims adjuster's salary and a part-time bookkeeping income, and we were proud of what we built, a small brick house outside Dayton, Ohio, paid off in full by the time I was 55. What Renee and Todd didn't know, what nobody outside of my accountant and one very old friend knew, was that my wife's mother had left us a piece of undeveloped land in Florida back in the 90s that nobody wanted at the time. Swampland, everyone called it. 22 years later, a developer bought out that entire stretch of county to build a retirement community, and the check that arrived in my mailbox had 7 figures on it. I never told my daughter. I never told anyone. I put it with a financial advisor named Pete Doyle, a man who'd handled Carol's late mother's estate and who I trusted with my life, and I let it sit and grow while I kept driving my truck and clipping coupons and wearing the same 3 flannel shirts I'd worn for a decade. I did this because after Carol died, I watched something change in my daughter that scared me more than the grief did. She started talking about money the way some people talk about weather, constantly, anxiously, and always circling back to what she didn't have. Todd's commissions were unpredictable. They'd bought a house they couldn't afford in a neighborhood called Bellhaven Estates, the kind of place with a stone sign at the entrance and a monthly homeowners association fee higher than my truck payment. When Miles turned 8, Renee called me in tears saying the local public school had just cut its gifted program, and Miles was going to fall behind for life if he didn't get into Whitcomb Academy, a private school 40 minutes from their house with a tuition bill of $14,000 a year. I told her I'd help. I have never regretted loving that boy. What I regretted, slowly over 6 years, was watching helping with tuition become the entire architecture of my relationship with my own daughter. The calls became a rhythm I could set a clock to. Every August, the first tuition installment. Every December, a call about the winter uniform blazer Miles had outgrown, and could I send $400? Every spring, a call about a school trip to Washington, D.C. $600, non-refundable, due by Friday. I paid every single one. I told myself I was investing in my grandson's future, and in some sense that was true. But I also noticed, the way you notice a hairline crack in a foundation long before you notice the wall start to lean, that Renee's calls almost never came just to talk. My birthday would pass with a text. Father's Day would pass with a text. But an invoice from Whitcomb Academy would get a phone call within the hour. I ran my own quiet stress test, though I didn't call it that at the time. 2 years ago, I sold my truck, the newer one, and bought the older one you see in this thumbnail, the one with 210,000 miles, on purpose. I told Renee I'd had some setbacks with my retirement account. Nothing dramatic, just tightening the belt. I wanted to see if my daughter's love for me had any weight of its own, separate from the checks. I watched the frequency of her calls stay exactly the same. Only the content changed. Now, along with the tuition asks, there was a new thread running through every conversation. A gentle, persistent suggestion that maybe it was time I did something with the house, since it was just me rattling around in there now. I want to tell you about the night everything cracked, because I've replayed it more times than I can count, and I still land in the same place every time. It wasn't a explosion. It was a door, closing softly, which somehow hurt more. It was the engagement party for Todd's business partner's daughter, held at Bellhaven Estates Clubhouse, the kind of event with a string quartet and a cash bar disguised as an open bar. Renee had invited me 2 weeks earlier, told me it would mean a lot to Todd's professional circle to see the whole family there. I bought a new shirt for it, the first new piece of clothing I'd bought myself in 3 years. I drove the 40 minutes out to Bellhaven that Saturday evening, with a bottle of wine I'd picked out carefully at a shop that actually knew wine, wanting to do this right. I got there 20 minutes early because that's how I was raised, and I stood in the parking lot a moment collecting myself before walking in. Through the clubhouse's big glass windows, I could see Renee already inside, laughing with a cluster of women in cocktail dresses, champagne flutes in hand. I walked up to the entrance, and a young man in a vest, clearly hired for the evening, checked a list on a clipboard and told me my name wasn't on it. I told him there must be a mistake. My daughter invited me personally. He was polite about it, said he'd go find someone. Renee came out a few minutes later. She didn't hug me. She stepped just outside the door, pulled it mostly shut behind her the way you do when you don't want the cold air getting in, and she looked at my shirt, my shoes, my haircut, in that fast, assessing way I remembered from when she was a teenager, sizing up whether I'd embarrass her at a school function. "Dad," she said, keeping her voice low, "this isn't really the right crowd for you tonight. These are Todd's clients. It's a whole different world out here." I asked her what that meant, exactly, a different world. She sighed. That particular sigh she'd perfected, the one that made me feel like an inconvenience she'd been carrying for years and was finally setting down in public. She said Todd's business partner's family were serious money, old Cincinnati money, and that having me there in my flannel talking about insurance claims would make Todd look like he came from nothing. She actually used those words, come from nothing. I stood there in the cold with an $80 bottle of wine in my hand and asked if Miles was inside. She said he was with a sitter at home, that this wasn't a kid event. I asked if I could at least come in for 10 minutes, say hello to a few people, have one glass of wine, and leave. She said it would look strange if I left early, and it would look worse if I stayed and someone asked Todd who I was. "Just head home, Dad. I'll call you tomorrow." She went back inside. The door clicked shut, and through the glass I watched her rejoin the circle of laughing women without missing a beat, as if the conversation with me had cost her nothing at all. I stood in that parking lot for a long time. Long enough that the valet, a kid who couldn't have been older than 19, eventually asked if I needed help finding my car. I told him no, I was just leaving. I set the bottle of wine on the low stone wall by the entrance, because I decided I didn't want it in my truck, reminding me of that night, and I drove home in silence. I didn't cry. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think men my age get told we're supposed to cry to prove we felt something, and I didn't. What I felt was colder than crying. I felt exactly the way I used to feel reading a fraud file where all the small inconsistencies I'd been ignoring for years suddenly lined up into one very clear picture. I'd spent 6 years telling myself Renee loved me and simply expressed it badly, that she was stressed, that Todd's world had rubbed off on her, that underneath it all was still my little girl who used to fall asleep on my chest in the recliner. Standing in that parking lot, I finally let myself see the whole file. My daughter was not confused about how to treat me. She had made a clear, repeated, deliberate choice over and over to treat me as a resource to be managed and occasionally hidden, depending on the room. I drove straight home and sat at my kitchen table with a cup of black coffee I didn't drink. I got out a legal pad, the same kind I'd used for 38 years of claims files, and I wrote at the top in block letters, "Whitfield, Miles tuition audit." I want to be clear with you about something before I go on, because I know some of you are already forming an opinion about what I did next, and I want you to have the full picture first. I did not decide that night to punish my grandson. I decided to stop being an invisible bank account for people who had made it very clear they were embarrassed by the man attached to it. Those are two very different things, and the difference matters more than anything else in this story. The following Monday, I called Whitcomb Academy's business office myself, something I had never once done in 6 years, because Renee always handled the logistics, as she called it, while I simply wired the money. I spoke to a woman named Miss Aldridge in accounts. I told her I wanted to review the full tuition and fee history for Miles Whitfield Doyle, since I was the one who had funded the account directly from my own bank for the past 6 years. She pulled it up without hesitation, since my account and routing number were on file as the payer. What she read back to me took the temperature in that kitchen down several more degrees. The base tuition was $14,000 a year, which I had always paid promptly and in full. But layered on top of that, going back nearly 3 years, were what the school called enrichment fees. A private tutor Whitcomb contracted with, $600 a month, paid directly by me through an automatic draft Renee had set up on my account during a visit 2 years ago, back when she'd asked to help me simplify my online banking on my laptop while she was staying over one weekend. I remembered that weekend. I remembered feeling grateful that my daughter wanted to spend time with me, sitting beside me at the kitchen table, clicking through screens I barely understood. I had no idea what she'd actually set up while she had access. I asked Miss Aldridge to send me a full year of statements for that enrichment draft. She did, that same afternoon, by email. I sat with my reading glasses and a highlighter and went through them the way I used to go through suspicious claims files, line by line. The tutor's name on the invoice was a company called Ascend Learning Partners. $600 a month, drafted from my account for private tutoring for Miles. Except when I called Ascend Learning Partners directly, using the phone number right there on the invoice, the man who answered told me, after I explained who I was and gave him Miles's name, that Miles hadn't had a single session with them in over a year. The account was technically still open. The monthly retainer was still being charged, but nobody had used it. I asked him where the $600 a month had been going, if not towards sessions. He said, somewhat uncomfortably, that Ascend Learning Partners function as a broker, and that unused retainer balances, per the original signed agreement, could be redirected by the account holder toward other approved enrichment services without needing to notify the payer, since the payer had signed a broad authorization form. He read me the name on that authorization form. It wasn't mine. My name was on the payment account. The authorization form, the one giving someone permission to redirect the funds, was signed by Renee Whitfield Doyle, using power of attorney documentation she claimed to have on file for me. I have never signed a power of attorney for my daughter. Not once, not ever, for any reason. I sat very still in my kitchen for a long moment. Then I asked the man to email me a copy of that authorization form. He said he'd need consent from the account holder, meaning Renee, since she was listed as the administrative contact. I told him I was the actual account holder, the man whose bank account had been drafted for 3 years, and that if he didn't send it to me directly, my next call would be to a lawyer and then to his company's compliance department. He sent it within the hour. The signature at the bottom was my name, Harold Whitfield, in handwriting that was close enough to fool a stranger glancing at it quickly, but not close enough to fool a man who has signed his own name on 38 years of claim settlements. My H has a particular hook at the top. My W has 3 even points, not 4 uneven ones. Whoever signed this had studied my signature from an old check or a card and gotten the shape almost right, and gotten the feeling of it entirely wrong. I want you to understand what I felt in that moment, because I think it surprised even me. It wasn't rage. Rage is loud, and it burns fast, and it usually burns out. What I felt was the same cold, methodical clarity I used to feel opening a fraud file on my desk on a Monday morning, knowing I had a long week of careful work ahead of me, and knowing exactly how it would end if I did the work correctly. Once you find one irregularity in an account, you don't stop there. That was rule number 1 in 38 years of claims work. You pull everything. So I did. I called Pete Doyle, my financial advisor, the man who'd managed that Florida land money quietly for over 2 decades, and I asked him to run a complete history on every account linked to my Social Security number, every card, every draft, every authorized user. Pete had handled Carol's estate and my finances with total discretion for 20 years. He didn't ask why. He just started pulling records. What came back over the following 2 days was worse than the tutoring redirect, considerably worse. 3 years ago, Around the same time as that laptop help session, a second credit card had been opened in my name. Not a joint card, an entirely new card, using my social security number and a forwarding address that, when I looked it up, was a private mailbox rental service 12 miles from my house, not my actual address. The statements for that card had never come to my mailbox because they were never meant to. That card had a credit limit of $18,000, and it was, as of the week I discovered it, sitting at just under $17,000 of debt, almost entirely maxed. I asked Pete to pull the transaction history. Line by line, I read charges for a landscaping company in Belhaven Estates, a country club initiation deposit at a place called Cross Creek, where Todd apparently golfed with his clients, a furniture store downtown, two separate charges to a company that, when I searched it, turned out to be a boutique that sold designer handbags. None of it was mine. All of it was on a card carrying my name, my social security number, and a credit history that, until that week, I had spent nearly 7 decades protecting. I sat at my kitchen table that night with two folders in front of me. One held the tutoring redirect and the forged authorization form. The other held the secret credit card statements. I thought about Miles, eating dinner somewhere in that big house in Belhaven right now, probably doing his homework, having no idea any of this was happening around him. I want to say clearly, for anyone watching who has a grandchild caught in the middle of something like this, that boy was never, for 1 second, my target. He was the reason I'd let it go on as long as I had. But I am an old claims man, and I know something that took me decades to fully understand. The people who steal quietly from family members they've decided are weak or foolish or too much in love to ever check the numbers do not stop stealing on their own. They stop when the numbers stop being available. That was the entire lesson of my career. Fraud doesn't correct itself. It has to be found, and then it has to be closed. I did not call Renee that night. I did not scream into the phone or drive out to Belhaven Estates and bang on that big front door. Grant told me later, after everything, that this restraint was the single smartest thing I did because it gave me time to build something airtight instead of something emotional. Grant Holloway was an old friend of Carol's from her college years, a lawyer who had gone on to build one of the more feared litigation practices in Columbus, and who had never once, in 20 years, sent me a bill for anything. He owed Carol a debt from a long time ago, back when she'd helped him through a rough patch most people never knew about. And he had told me at her funeral that if I ever needed him for anything, day or night, I only had to call. I called him the morning after I found the credit card statements. I drove the 90 minutes to Columbus that same afternoon and sat across from him in an office with a view of the river, and I laid both folders on his desk. Grant read through everything twice, in complete silence, adjusting his glasses once. When he finished, he looked up at me and asked one question first, before anything about strategy. Did I want to protect Miles through all of this, no matter what happened to his parents? I told him yes, absolutely, without hesitation. That was non-negotiable. Grant nodded slowly and said that was the right answer, and that it would shape everything we did from here forward. He explained the legal landscape to me clearly. The tuition redirect and the forged authorization form were serious. A mix of fraud and unauthorized use of a power of attorney that didn't exist, but on their own they might be argued down as a misunderstanding by a decent defense lawyer, a family member overstepping boundaries rather than committing a crime. The secret credit card was an entirely different category. Opening a line of credit using someone else's social security number without consent, especially routing the statements to a private mailbox to hide it, was identity theft, plain and simple. A federal matter once you accounted for the fact that some of those charges had almost certainly crossed state lines through online purchases. Grant told me the same thing another lawyer told a father in a story very much like this one, and it stuck with me because it was true. If we came at this with anger, Renee would lawyer up immediately, and we'd spend 2 years in courtrooms arguing about intent. If we came at it with patience and let her own greed keep moving without interference for a little while longer, she would eventually make a mistake so large it would remove any question of intent entirely. So Grant's advice was simple. Do nothing dramatic yet. Quietly close what could be closed without alerting anyone, and document everything else. That week, I went to my bank in person and froze the fraudulent credit card, filed an identity theft report with the federal authorities, and requested a full credit freeze on my name going forward, meaning no new lines of credit could open under my social security number without my physical presence and a government ID. I also called Whitcomb Academy directly and since I was the verified payer of record, canceled the automatic enrichment draft to Ascend Learning Partners, while making sure very specifically that Miles's base tuition draft for the semester remained completely untouched and paid in full. I want to say that again clearly because I think it matters. I never once let my grandson's actual education be at risk. I only cut off the siphon that had been quietly feeding a lifestyle that had nothing to do with him. The 11 days that followed were the quietest of my life, and also the loudest inside my own head. On day 4, Renee called about a billing glitch at Whitcomb. Her voice was light, almost bored, the way you talk about a minor inconvenience. I told her I'd look into it. I did not tell her I already knew exactly what it was. On day 7, the fraudulent credit card, now frozen, got declined at what the transaction log later showed was a car dealership, where Todd had apparently been trying to put a down payment on a new SUV using a card he believed had over $1,000 of available credit still on it. That night, Renee called twice. I let both go to voicemail. In the first one, her voice had an edge to it I hadn't heard directed at me before, an edge usually reserved for customer service representatives who disappointed her. In the second, left 40 minutes later, that edge had a thin layer of panic underneath it, though she was clearly trying to keep her tone light. "Dad, call me back. It's about the card thing. I think there's a mix-up on your end." On day 9, Miss Aldridge from Whitcomb's office called me directly, apologetically, to say Miles's enrichment tutoring draft had been declined and asking if there was an issue with my account. I told her, truthfully, that the enrichment charge had been intentionally canceled by me because it was tied to services that were never being used, but that she should confirm right now, on this call, that the base tuition remained fully paid and Miles's enrollment was in no way affected. She confirmed it was. I thanked her and told her that was the only account I intended to touch. On day 11, my phone rang 43 times between 2 in the afternoon and 9 at night. I know the number precisely because I wrote it down on my legal pad each time, the way I used to log call attempts on a claims file with the exact time beside each one. Renee, Renee, Renee. Then, starting around 6 o'clock, a number I didn't recognize, which turned out to be Todd, calling from what I later learned was the finance office of that car dealership, apparently trying to get me to verbally authorize a manual override on a card that federal fraud protocols had already flagged and frozen. I answered the 12th call, right around 4 in the afternoon, and said nothing at first. I just listened. "Dad, are you there?" Renee's voice was fast, clipped. "Something is wrong with your account. It's like it's been frozen or something, and it's messing up some things for us. Can you call the bank and fix it?" I asked her, very calmly, what exactly needed fixing. She said there'd been some sort of identity theft alert on a card, and it was declining everywhere, and could I please just call the fraud department and tell them it was a false alarm so they'd release the hold. I told her it wasn't a false alarm. I told her, plainly, that I had discovered a credit card opened in my name 3 years ago, without my knowledge, with statements routed to a private mailbox so I would never see them, and that I had already filed an identity theft report with federal authorities the week before. The silence on the other end of that line lasted longer than any silence I'd ever heard from my daughter. Then she started talking very fast, the way people do when the ground has just shifted under them and they're trying to talk faster than gravity. She said it must be some kind of mistake. Some scammer must have used my information. She had no idea what I was talking about. We needed to figure this out together as a family. I told her I already had the authorization form for the tutoring redirect in front of me, the one with my forged signature on it, and I told her I recognized the handwriting well enough to know it wasn't mine, and that I'd like her to explain that one first, since it was a much smaller matter than the credit card, before we discussed anything else. She hung up on me. That surprised me more than anything else that had happened up to that point. In 31 years of being her father, my daughter had never once hung up on me. She called back 4 minutes later, and this time Todd was on the line too, his voice loud in the background, something about needing to handle this like adults, and how I was blowing a simple family misunderstanding completely out of proportion. I told them both, in the same flat, even tone I used to use delivering claim denials to people who'd set their own garages on fire, that I would be happy to discuss it in person at Grant Holloway's office in Columbus the following Tuesday afternoon. I gave them the address. I told them to bring whatever documentation they believed supported their position. Then I hung up first, which I don't think either of them expected me to be capable of. They showed up 11 minutes early. Grant's office has cameras in the lobby and in the conference room, standard security for a firm that handles the kind of high-stakes litigation he does, all clearly disclosed on signage at the entrance, which matters a great deal for what happened next. Renee walked in wearing the kind of composed, slightly wounded expression she'd perfected over the years for moments when she needed to look like the reasonable one. Todd walked in like a man who sold real estate for a living, meaning like a man who believed every room could be talked into anything if he just kept talking. They sat across the conference table from me and Grant. Todd started first, before anyone else could speak, saying this whole thing was clearly some kind of misunderstanding, blown up by a lot of stress, and that families handle these things privately, not through lawyers. Grant let him finish completely before responding, which I noticed was itself a kind of pressure, letting a man talk himself into a corner with nobody interrupting. Then Grant slid 2 documents across the table. The first was the forged authorization form. The second was a signature exemplar report from a handwriting analyst Grant had retained that same week, someone who routinely testified in estate disputes, comparing the authorization signature against 6 verified samples of my actual signature spanning the past decade. The analyst's written conclusion was blunt. The signature on the authorization form did not match the exemplars with a degree of certainty the analyst described in writing as conclusive. Renee's face changed color slightly. She said she didn't know anything about that. Maybe the school had made an error somewhere on their end. Grant, very calmly, said that was certainly possible, and asked if she'd mind if we called Whitcomb's business office right then, on speaker, to ask exactly who had submitted that form. I watched my daughter's composed expression crack for the first time in longer than I could remember. She said that wouldn't be necessary. Grant said he thought it might be helpful for everyone's clarity, and dialed anyway. Miss, Aldridge answered, professional and unaware. She was on speaker in a legal conference. Grant asked her, simply, whether she could confirm who had originally submitted the enrichment fund authorization form 3 years earlier. Miss, Aldridge said the form had been dropped off in person and signed at their front desk by, and here she paused to check the file, Mrs. Renee Whitfield Doyle, who had presented herself as her father's authorized representative. Renee reached over and ended the call herself, her hand shaking slightly. She said fine, yes, she had filled that form out, but only because the tutoring money was basically going to Miles anyway, just in a different way, and that I had way more money than I ever let on, so this was hardly some kind of tragedy. I asked her, quietly, how she knew I had more money than I let on. That silence again. Longer this time. Grant moved on before she could answer, sliding the credit card documents across next, the statements, the private mailbox address, the transaction history. He said this piece was considerably more serious than a school form, because it constituted identity theft under federal law, a felony, regardless of family relationship, and that federal authorities had already been notified the week prior, as required once the fraud report was filed. Todd stood up at that point, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, and said this was absolutely insane, that nobody was going to prison over a country club deposit and some furniture, that I clearly had more money than any of us needed to worry about, and was choosing, out of pure spite, to weaponize the legal system against his own family over what amounted to pocket change to a man in my position. I told him, still sitting, still calm, that the amount of money involved had never once been the point. The point was that someone had opened a credit account using my identity without my knowledge and routed the statements away from me specifically so I would never find out, and that the same person had forged my signature on a legal authorization form. I told him those were not family disagreements. Those were crimes with specific names that I had spent 38 years of my career investigating in other people's lives, and I recognized every single pattern sitting in front of me now. Renee started crying at that point, and I want to tell you honestly, it was the first time in this entire ordeal that I felt something crack in my own chest, because some part of me still saw the little girl who used to bring me dandelions from the backyard and call them roses. But I had learned something important in 38 years of reading fraud files. Genuine remorse and the fear of consequences produce very similar tears, and the only way to tell them apart is to watch what a person does next, not what they say while crying. What Renee did next was ask, through those tears, whether we could keep this between family and not involve the federal authorities at all, since it would destroy Todd's business reputation and could affect custody considerations for Miles down the road, if either of them ended up with any kind of criminal record. That sentence, more than anything else in 11 days, told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't crying over what she'd done. She was crying over the exposure. Grant, in his measured lawyer's voice, explained that federal identity theft reports, once filed, cannot simply be withdrawn on request, and that the investigation was already active, regardless of what happened in this room today. He explained that the far more productive use of everyone's time now was discussing restitution, boundaries, and, given that a minor child's stability was involved, what arrangement would actually protect Miles through whatever came next. I want to slow down here, because this is the part of the story I think matters most, and the part I never want anyone watching this to misunderstand. I told Renee and Todd in that conference room exactly what I wanted moving forward, and none of it was designed to punish Miles for his parents' choices. First, I told them the fraudulent credit card would remain part of the federal identity theft case, regardless of any restitution offered, because that decision was no longer purely mine to make once the report was filed, but that I would provide a written statement to investigators noting that full restitution had been offered, which Grant told me could meaningfully affect how the matter was ultimately charged. Second, I told them that Miles's tuition at Whitcomb would continue to be paid, in full, directly by me to the school for as long as he wanted to attend there, with no funds ever again routed through any account either of his parents controlled. I set up a dedicated education trust with Pete Doyle that same week, naming Miles as the sole beneficiary for education expenses only, with the school paid directly, and no cash ever touching Renee or Todd's hands at any point. That boy was never going to lose a single day of school over what his parents did, and I wanted Renee to hear me say that clearly, in front of Grant, in front of Todd, so there could be no confusion about where my anger actually lived. Third, I told Renee that I intended to establish a separate, modest, direct relationship with Miles going forward, one that did not run through her as a gatekeeper, meaning regular calls, visits, holidays that were between me and my grandson directly, not contingent on whatever mood existed between his mother and me on a given week. Grant helped draft a simple, enforceable visitation understanding. Nothing dramatic, just something with actual teeth, so that Miles's relationship with me could never again be used as leverage in an argument about money. Fourth, and this was the part that hit hardest, I told them that beyond Miles's education trust, they would receive nothing further from me. No more tuition extras, no more emergency landscaping loans, no more quiet wires when Todd's commissions ran dry. I told them the era of me being an invisible, unquestioned source of funds was permanently over, and that whatever life they built from that point forward, they would build with their own resources, the way I had built mine. Todd tried one more time to argue that this was disproportionate, that everyone helps family, that I was punishing them for a mistake by treating them like criminals. I told him, and I remember this part word for word because I'd rehearsed it in my head for 11 days, that helping family and being secretly robbed by family were not the same category of thing, no matter how many times someone tried to blur that line, and that the moment they chose forgery and identity theft over simply calling me and asking for help honestly, they had made that choice themselves. Nobody made that choice for them. I told him a man who spends 38 years sorting real hardship from manufactured excuses does not confuse the two easily, not even when the person making the excuse is his own daughter. The federal investigation moved forward exactly as Grant predicted. Because the fraudulent card had been used for online purchases that crossed state lines, and because a forged authorization document had been used to redirect education funds, the case ultimately involved both federal wire fraud statutes and identity theft charges. Renee's attorney negotiated a plea agreement, given her cooperation and the restitution timeline we'd already put in place. She received 5 years of probation, mandatory financial counseling, and a restitution order, requiring her and Todd to repay the full balance of the fraudulent card, roughly $17,000, directly to me, in monthly installments Grant structured so they'd actually be enforceable. Todd, whose name did not appear on the forged authorization but who Grant's investigator later confirmed had known about and benefited from the secret card the entire time, was charged separately with a lesser fraud count tied to his knowing use of stolen credit and received probation and a fine as well. No prison time for either of them, and I want to be honest that a part of me, the old claims investigator part, thought the consequences were lighter than the crime deserved. But Grant reminded me that the goal was never to destroy my daughter. The goal was to make the theft stop, protect Miles, and make sure nothing like this could ever quietly happen again. I see Miles every other Saturday now, sometimes more. We go fishing at a little lake outside Dayton that Carol and I used to visit, and he's gotten remarkably good at it for a 12-year-old, better than I was at his age. He knows some of what happened in the simplified, age-appropriate way. Grant and a family counselor helped Renee explain it to him, that Grandpa and Mom had a big disagreement about money that they're working through, and that it doesn't change how much Grandpa loves him. He still attends Whitcomb. His tuition has never once been late, and it never will be, because it no longer depends on anyone's mood or marriage or business quarter. Renee and I talk now, cautiously, maybe twice a month. It isn't what it used to be, and I've stopped expecting it to become what I once imagined it might be. Some structures, once they crack in a certain place, can be reinforced enough to stand safely, but they never go back to looking exactly like the original blueprint. I've made peace with that. What I haven't made peace with, and don't intend to, is ever again being someone's unquestioned, unexamined bank account, mistaken for love simply because the money kept arriving on schedule. I still drive the same truck with 210,000 miles on it. Pete tells me I could buy a small fleet of them without noticing the dent in my accounts, and I tell him every time that the truck still runs fine and that a man doesn't need to look wealthy to be secure. He just needs to know exactly what he's worth and to whom. If there's one thing I hope you take from tonight, whoever you are, wherever you're sitting listening to this, it's this. Love your children. Help your grandchildren with your whole heart for as long as you're able. But never let helping become a habit nobody ever has to say thank you for. And never let silence about what you truly have become an invitation for someone to take what was never offered. The moment you find the first small inconsistency, the first thing that doesn't quite add up, don't look away from it because you're afraid of what the whole file might say. Pull the whole file. I promise you, the truth is always kinder in the long run than the story you tell yourself to avoid finding it.